Things were not going well at Washington Irving Junior High School. Mr. Barber told me I needed to put a new brown paper bag cover on the geography, the story of the world, which I hadn't bothered doing since I was leaving it in my locker room instead of bringing it to class, and I think Mr. Barber was starting to suspect that I'd taken his new book and destroyed it. I hadn't turned in my chapter review map on the culture of China to Mr. McElroy, and no, I didn't know if I was going to get it done or not. Jane Eyre still hadn't figured out that she was in love with Mr. Rochester, and I mean, how many more clues do you need? I didn't raise my hand anymore in Mrs. Vern's class, and after the first time I didn't bother answering even when she called on me. So then, she stopped calling on me. I spent PE running the cross-country course while the rest of the class started in on the wrestling unit. No one said anything when I went out, not even the so-called gym teacher. And I didn't do anything on the next 2 lab experiments in Mr. Ferris's class either. Lil did them both. Even the smelly chemical stuff. And so what that Apollo 7 successfully detached from the Saturn rocket to practice the rendezvous that they would have to perform perfectly for a moonshot? So what that they landed a mere third of a mile from the landing site? So what? Clarence is a stupid toy horse. Who cares if he's rocking like anything anyway? And because no matter where I went in stupid Junior Irving Junior High School, there was the look from everybody, and the laugh, and the smirk. Jerks. And no matter what, do you know what that feels like? So I stopped helping Miss Cowper with her county literacy unit. Who are we kidding anyway? I did do my Saturday deliveries, and guess who wanted the money and wouldn't let me stop? Dad's a jerk. I didn't meet Mr. Powell at the library afterwards either. I don't know if Lil was waiting there or not, because I didn't draw anymore. I didn't even want to. It was like that bligback gull had laid its head down and given up to the sky. So you can see why on the day of the annual Ballard paper mill harvest time employee picnic, I wasn't overcome with happiness and joy. And neither was my father. It was pretty clear that Mr. Big Bucks Ballard was an idiot, he said, and that my father or Ernie Echo could run the paper mill blindfolded and do it better, 100 times better than he could, he said. All Mr. Big Bucks Ballard did was sit around his big office wearing his nice shirt and tight silk tie and telling everyone else what to do, he said. But he never got his frickin' hands dirty. No, he didn't. You never saw him on a forklift. You never saw him backing a truck into a loading dock. Wood pulp. Big Bucks Ballard wouldn't recognize it if he tripped and fell into his own frickin' head, he said. And that's what happens when you get rich. You leave all the real work to the little guy and you sit back and enjoy all the profits, he said. And it was going to take a whole lot more than a Harvard Time picnic to change things the way they ought to be. And when my father was home, and let me tell you, it wasn't often, since Ernie Echo came over most nights and they drove off together, but when he was home, that's pretty much what he told us. So no one wanted to go. Not to a picnic thrown by a jerk like Mr. Big Bucks Ballard. But on that last Saturday in October, my father made all of us get in the car and drive to the annual Ballard Paper Mill Harvest Time employee picnic. He even made my brother go. You can imagine how happy we were, especially when my father said that Mr. Big Bucks Ballard was the skinflint of skinflints and probably wouldn't be much to eat. And that there wasn't going to be all that good. You don't expect a jerk and a skinflint to be grateful to his employees, do you? And the only reason we were going, he said, was the trivia contest. And the trivia contest, according to Ernie Echo, was all about Babe Ruth. And who knew more about Babe Ruth than my father? No one. And I'm not lying. Do you know how many World Series home runs Babe Ruth hit? No, you don't. But my father did. There were 15. And you probably don't know that in 1927, Babe Ruth hit his famous 60 home runs in a single season. But do you know who hit 59 home runs? Probably you don't. But my father did. He hit them in 1921. Babe Ruth did. And do you know how many home runs Babe Ruth hit in the final game of 1928? 3 in one game. And guess who knew that too? My father. My father could tell you that a whole lot more because he once had met Babe Ruth. He shook the Babe Ruth's hand and brought him a beer. And Babe Ruth had winked at him and said, You're a hell of a good guy. My father loved Babe Ruth. And Ernie Echo said that the prize for the trivia contest was going to be a baseball signed by a Yankee. It was probably, Ernie Echo said, a baseball signed by the Babe. And so we all went to the annual paper mill harvest time employee picnic because my father wanted to win a baseball signed by Babe Ruth. Terrific. I had to run through the Saturday morning deliveries pretty quickly, which wasn't hard, as you might remember, since not everyone knows the basic principles of physical science. Mrs. Mason hasn't ordered any donuts, and Mr. Loeffler didn't have a single light bulb to change. And Mrs. Doherty's kids were playing upstairs when I came. And Mrs. Windermere never came into the kitchen. I really wish that at least the Doherty kids had been... You know what? So what? So what? I'm not a chump. I made it back as quickly as any human being could, which wasn't good enough for guess who. It was a Saturday that somehow knew was going to be one of my last beautiful days of fall. The sun was shining hot like it was still July, and November drizzles were a whole season away. The sky was blue, and the few white clouds were easing themselves along the way they didn't care. The grass was warm and sweet like April, but the trees hadn't forgotten it was October. They were all on fire, and beneath their leaves the birds were singing their last songs, and waves of heat shimmered from the stone walls, and the granite sparkled. "Such a beautiful day," said my mother. My father didn't say anything. He was probably thinking about Babe Ruth. The annual Ballard paper mill harvest time employee picnic was held at Mary's Lake, and since we got there late, we had to park about a mile away, all because my father said I hadn't finished the deliveries on time. Not that it mattered, since Duggo couldn't hurry up if there was an atomic bomb on his butt. But when from a mile away you could smell that chicken grilling as soon as you got out of the car, and you could also hear the hollering and all the cheering of the people. People called and waved at each other as we walked down the lake, and when they waved at us, the two women came to meet my mother and took her by the arms and brought her over to introduce her to someone else she had to meet because they didn't live very far from each other at all. And hadn't they seen her this fall at St. Ignatius? My father and brother and I, though, we passed by some long tables and someone called out to us, and my father grunted back, and then someone looked through a bunch of wrapped packages and picked two up and called to me and my brother and handed them to us. Inside was a Timex watch, and I'm not lying, a Timex watch with a second hand and a real leather band and numbers for a regular time and numbers for military time. A Timex watch. It was compliments of the Ballard paper mill. And so my brother looked at me and I looked at him. Sometimes, and I know it doesn't last for anything more than a second, sometimes there can be a perfect understanding between two people who can't understand each other. He smiled, and at that moment I smiled, and we put the Timex watches on, and we watched the seconds slip by. It was the first watch my brother had ever owned. It was the first watch I'd ever owned. My father looked at our riches. "That metal's going to turn your skin green, I bet. Just wait and see. Anything from Big Bucks Ballard's going to make your skin green." And I did not know that so many people worked at the Ballard paper mill. It looked like all of Marysville was there. There was a group playing volleyball, and no one was pretending to keep score. There was a baseball game going on, husbands against wives. I guess you can imagine how funny that was. My father went over to stand with Ernie Echo, just to laugh and smirk. There were about 10 guys throwing horseshoes, and the clangs and cheers that came from them made it seem like it was all fired important, like it probably was a bunch of chumps. I went down to the lake, and it was so hot there that a whole bunch of kids were swimming, which I decided not to do, but you know why I wasn't going to swim. And about 8 teens were doing chicken fights, and some of them were diving off each other's shoulders, and James Russell was there, and he waved at me to come in, but I just shook my head, and he nodded. He knew. And drifting over everything was the smell of grilling chicken, the snap of butter fat when it fell into the fire, and the smoke that drew up over the baseball game, and the volleyball and the horseshoes that drifted over to the rows of long tables with bright white cloths over them. where the women, including my mother, were setting out the bowls of salad and plates of rolls and pitchers of pink lemonade and platters of corn on the cob, were steaming, and more bowls of salad until people started to crowd away from the baseball game. And then, on the cooks by the grills, hollered out, "We're all set!" And everyone came and found a place in line while the cooks carried the long trays heaped with chicken, and the smell in the hot blue air was so wonderful. And I looked over at my mother, and she was smiling to the beat the band, like she had come home after a long time away. It turned out that my brother was the first in line. There's a shock. But it didn't matter, because even if the whole town of Marysville had been there, they couldn't have eaten everything that was loading off those tables. It was like something out of a fairy tale. When a platter was empty, it got lifted away, and then another one, instantly, even fuller than the first, magically appeared in its place. And there were more chicken cooking, and more vats of hot water with steaming corn, and onto the line came all the kids from the lake who were dripping wet, and they were all hollering that it didn't matter if they ate like slobs, because they were just going to go back into the water anyways. And then everyone finished the salad and chicken and corn and trying to sit back and rub their stomachs like big aluminum carts being wheeled across the lawn, and every kid in the place running to them and reaching in for lime popsicles and strawberry shortcake and ice cream sandwiches, and James Russell grabbing me and yelling, "Come on!" And I was running over too and reaching in for an orange dreamsicle. An orange dreamsicle. You know how good an orange dreamsicle tastes on a blue fall day when you're full of grilled chicken and your mother is laughing a real laugh like she used to? And once you looked over and your father is holding her hand like they haven't in a long, long, long time? That is, until Ernie Echo came, and at that moment, she walked away. And then all the mothers cleared the tables and swept off all the long white tablecloths, and all laughing, they folded them together and boxed up the extra food. And let me tell you, there was a lot of extra food. And the kids ran down to the water again, and James Russell said, "Come on!" But I shook my head again. So he ran down the lake, and I tried not to hate him when he took a flying dive and skimmed the water, and he came up laughing, and some kids were climbing on top of him for more chicken fights. And then most of the adults started to gather around the cleared tables, and I went over to the deserted horseshoe pit to see what was all so fired important about throwing horseshoes. And someone yelled that the trivia contest was going to start soon, and everyone should find a partner to work with. I looked back, and my father was standing with Ernie Echo. They were whispering together. Yeah, I guess they would probably win, too. But I picked up a horseshoe and I threw it. It came up short. By a lot. I tried another and it came up short again. By a lot. So I heaved another and it was long. By a lot. Terrific. So then I threw the last one and it hit short again, but it rolled until it flopped in the sand near the post. Not bad. Which is exactly what an old guy said when I went to gather up the horseshoes. Not bad. But I think if you could hold it at the bend, you might get a little more distance. I picked up the 4 horseshoes. Do you want to show me how? He took a shoe and held it with the ends out. Like this. He walked over to the post. You stand with your heel here and you swing it back. He did this a couple times. Then you release it on the upswing. Which he did. It was a ringer, but it clanged the post. Everything after that is just practice, he said. And so I tried it, and I stood with my heel like that, and swung my arm a couple times like that, and I looked at him, and he nodded, and so I let one fly past. I think you might want a little bit more arc to the throw. That way you won't run away after they hit the ground. I let another one fly, but it was short. I guess I gave it too much arc. Not bad, he said. And I handed him the last shoe. I'm not a chump. He took the shoe into the hands like he was done it 1.5 million times, and he set the heel and he swung his arm. The horseshoe left his arm and carried up into the blue air, and it turned once slowly, like it was taking its time. And as it fell down the post, it threw out its 2 ends like a diver and dropped onto the sand without even bouncing, without even touching the post, but circling to it perfectly, that it was like someone had walked up there and set it down that way on purpose. And I looked at him. I told you, it's all practice from here. But what I could use is some help with this trivia contest. I've been working at it for 25 years, and I never have come close to finding a ringer. He held out his hand, and we shook. Partners? he said, and we went over to the cleared tables. Back there, a few kids were eating the last of the ice cream sandwiches, while a bunch of the men had lit cigars, and their long smoke whispered up the golden trees. Piles of yellow pads and pencils were on the tables, and partners were taking them and writing their names on them. And part of the partners were pretty serious about it all, and they sat there numbering their pads. This was my father and Ernie Echo. Most were leaning back and forth, laughing, probably because they didn't know 2 cents about the babe, and they figured they were just not going to win anyway, so it didn't matter. And you know what? Most of the people were right. My father was going to crush them all. Then some guy wearing a tie at a picnic. This guy stood up in a chair and held a black notebook over his head, and everyone cheered. I figured that the guy with the tie had to have been Mr. Big Bucks Ballard, the jerk who didn't know how to run a paper company as well as my father and Ernie Echo could blindfolded. The trivia questions, he hollered, and everyone cheered and clapped again. There will be 10 questions, he said, and a tiebreaker, if we need one. The team with the most correct answers will be the winning team. This year's prize is a baseball signed by... Okay, you're going to think that I made this next part up, but I didn't. Sometimes you just have to trust me. This is what the guy said. A baseball signed by Roger Maris, Mickey Mantle, and Joe Pepitone. There are cheers from all around, except for my father and Ernie Echo. Plus, this year, there'll be a $50 bonus for each person. You can bet there were cheers at this, though. Plus, assigned parking spots right by the mill entrance for 1 whole year. I guess this sounded good to a whole lot of people since there was a whole lot more chairs at this, too. So let's get started. A baseball signed by Roger Maris, Mickey Mantle, and Joe Pepitone, who, if you remember, were the 3 Yankees that hit home runs in Game 6 of the 1964 World Series against the St. Louis Cardinals. Who cares if Mr. Big Bucks Ballard is an idiot? God, this is an awesome prize. I looked at my partner. Do you think we have a chance? He asked. You bet we do, I said. Guys, I want to take a second here. If you notice, during the time when Doug was bragging about his dad and said that his dad knew this, his dad knew that, his dad knew this, his dad knew that. I ask you, did you notice something during that scene? We learned that his dad might have knew that, all that stuff. But what else can we learn? Who else obviously knew all this information? Anybody? Up front, maybe? That's right. We learned that Doug also knew all this information too. So Doug might be very much a contender in this trivia game as well. I also want you to think about who is this mystery partner that Doug has right now. Question number 1, said Mr. Big Bucks Ballard. He was standing on a chair. How long was Joe DiMaggio's hitting streak in 1941? My partner looked at me. Do you know? He said. I took the pencil and I wrote down 56. If he didn't even know that one, I thought, this isn't going to be much help. Are you ready? Come on, folks. Either you know it or you don't. I wouldn't bother guessing if you don't. Next question. How many consecutive scoreless innings were in the World Series play has Whitey Ford pitched? Groans and laughter all around us. Are you kidding me? Someone hollered. I handed the pencil back to my partner. 33 2/3, I whispered, and he wrote it down. Next question. In 1960, the Yankees hit more home runs than any other team in baseball history. How many did they hit? More groans, more laughter, and I whispered, 193. My partner wrote it down. Okay, are you ready for an easy one? Cheers. What 2 years did Roger Maris win back-to-back MVP awards? Even I know that one, said my partner, and he wrote down 1960 and 1961. All right, let's see how you are with batting averages. What is Joe DiMaggio's lifetime batting average? 325, I whispered. What was Mickey Mantle's best batting average for any year of his career? 365, I whispered. What was the team average of the Yankees in the 1960 World Series? 338, I whispered. Calm down, said Mr. Big Bucks Ballard, pulling out his tie. He must have been getting hot. There have to be some hard ones to separate the men from the boys. Apologize to Mrs. Stinson there. There was laughter. All right, try this one. How many American League pennants did the Yankees win over Casey Stengel? My partner looked at me. 10? He said, and I nodded, and he wrote it down. Question number 9. We all know that in 1961, Roger Maris broke the Babe's home run record with 61 home runs. How many did Mickey Mantle have in that same year? 54, I whispered, and my partner wrote that down too. And the last question, which 5 years in a row did the Yankees win the World Championship? That I can remember, said my partner. Apologies. And he wrote down 1949, 1950, 1951, 1952, and 1953. I was at the last game for every one of those, he said. Every single one? I said. He nodded. There's no pleasure in getting to be an old coot unless you have some fun along the way. Do I need to tell you that when Mr. Big Bucks Ballard read all the answers aloud, we had everyone right? Do I need to tell you that my father and Ernie Echo did not? Or what my father thought about a trivia contest in the New York Yankees that didn't have a single question about the Babe? But it wasn't over yet, because when Mr. Big Bucks Ballard asked if anyone had gotten all 10 right, 3 teams raised their hands. Terrific. Here y'all, all grumbling and carry on, but I guess it wasn't as hot as everyone thought. He took a sheet of paper from inside the black notebook. So now we go to the tiebreaker question, and this time I admitted it's a doozy. Okay, here goes. For just these 3 teams to see who gets the baseball, the bonus, and the parking spots. Are we ready? You all ready? Okay, and no one help, folks. Are you ready? Okay. What is important in baseball? What is important in baseball? That's all about the number 216. It was like all the creatine stopped. It was that quiet. Could you repeat the question? Someone asked. What is important about baseball about the number 216? I watched all the other teams. You might as well have asked them to name the atomic number of all the inert gases. My partner looked at me. I have no idea, he said. But I whispered to him. Are you sure? He said. And I nodded. How do you know that? I counted once. He smiled. Not like my mother, but his smile would do for now. Does anyone know? Hollered Mr. Big Bucks Ballard from his chair. The other 2 teams shook their heads, and my partner kept smiling, and he leaned down to me. Go tell him. So I did. But if you think I'm not so fired smart, then you won't think so after I tell you what happened next. There was some scattered clapping, and Mr. Big Bucks Ballard came out of his chair, walked over, and shook hands. How'd you know that last one, kid? He asked. He counted once, my partner said. And Mr. Big Bucks Ballard worked at his tie some more, and he looked really hot. How are we going to even award these prizes, he said. You're not driving yet, so you don't exactly need a parking spot, and it's hard to give the bonus when you're not even working in the mill. We'll figure it out, said my partner. And then Mr. Big Bucks Ballard looked at the partner. And how about you? You know you're not supposed to win. How come you can't win, sir? I said. And he laughed. Mr. Big Bucks Ballard laughed. Kid, how do you think it would look if the boss won all the prizes? Yeah, that would look pretty bad, but I mean, you weren't even playing. Not me. And at that moment, he pointed to my partner. But he was. I looked at my partner. Bob Ballard, he said. And he held out his hand. So guys, if you didn't pick up on that, Doug had been playing with Mr. Big Bucks Ballard the entire time and just didn't know it. I want you guys to think about right now, what are your opening impressions on Mr. Big Bucks Ballard? What do you think of him as a person? This was the partner that Doug had. This was the guy who taught him how to play horseshoes. What are your impressions of Mr. Big Bucks Ballard? How do they compare to what we've previously learned about Big Bucks Ballard from Doug's dad? So what does Doug's dad say about Big Bucks Ballard compared to what Doug thinks of him? The ride home was a pretty quiet one, except for my father, who pointed out how unfair it was to not have a single question about the Babe. Not one! and how the whole contest was a setup anyways, and how Mr. Big Bucks Ballard knew the questions all along, because how else could anyone know that last answer about 316? I almost corrected him and told him that it was actually 216, but actually I did say that. And he glared at me in the rearview mirror. Don't you get it? He set you up more than anyone. He just strung you right along and made it look like you were answering when he knew all the answers. That way he could win the prize for himself. You were his patsy. What a freaking cheapskate. He didn't want to give away any money. He didn't want to give up his parking spots. He probably doesn't even have the stupid baseball. He is a con artist. He probably didn't figure that anyone would see right through him. Did he even give you the baseball? Well, he told me to come to his office tomorrow after school. You shouldn't count on anything from him. That's the way he is in this freaking world. You're nothing but a jerk if you do think of him like that. I looked over at my brother, and at that moment, he was polishing the glass face of his Timex walk. Maybe my father was right. I didn't go to Mr. Big Bucks Ballard's office on Monday. I didn't want to find out if that's really the way things were in this freaking world. But here are the stats for the first week of November. No fights in the downstairs hall, even though I came close once. 1 fight in the upstairs hall. I lost. 2 fights in the PE locker room. 2 wins, after I showed I could kick just about anywhere. 2 fights in the boys' bathroom. 2 losses. There might have been a whole lot more fights in there, but I stopped going to the bathroom. You're right, and yes, I did get pretty uncomfortable. 4 fights in the way home from the after-school detention, and 4 losses. After school detention on Friday, I decided I didn't want to make it a week without 5 consecutive losses on the way home, so I gave the jerks who were waiting the slip by going out through the gym entrance. I had to hope the so-called gym teacher wouldn't see me, which he didn't, and across the stack out the back field and across town towards the dump. It took me right past the Ballard paper mill, and so I figured, you know what, why not? I might as well stop. And when I got to the mill, I'm not lying, you know, when you're getting close to a paper mill, and it's not because of the pretty scenery. When I got to the mill, I walked right around to the front entrance, facing the river. And right by the front door, right next to the stupid front door, and the best parking spot in the whole paper mill, my father's car was parked there. And next to it was Ernie Echo's pickup. He never said a thing to me either. Not one thing, not a thank you, nothing. So I went inside, where a woman on the phone smiled and raised her hand to tell me that she'd just be a second. It was a swell place. It was a real swell place. There was thick green carpet, paneled walls, pictures of the board of directors, lamps of green shades, red leather furniture. And by the windows, looking out the water, plants with long stems and flowers that, well, honestly, they were hard to describe. They didn't even look real. The woman hung up the phone. They're orchids. Mr. Ballard grows them. Most of these will be gone in a week or 2. Gone? When they start to blossom like that, he sends them to his old employees who still live in town. You're Douglas Swiatek, aren't you? I'm Miss Stenson. I'm sure he'll like to see you. Just let me call in. She didn't need to, because a door in the paneled walls opened, and there was Mr. Ballard himself, silk tie and all. My partner! Mrs. Stinson, have you met my partner? She smiled and laughed. Come in, he said. And I did. I guess I don't need to tell you about what his office was like, except that it was mostly like the room outside, but one wall had pictures of Mr. Ballard throwing horseshoes with a whole lot of people I didn't know, and a couple I did. There was Mayor John Lindsay, and I'm not lying. There was a picture of him throwing horseshoes with Lyndon B. Johnson. At that moment, he saw me look at it. Never throw horseshoes with a Texan. They don't like to lose. So, partner, what are you going to do with that $100 I gave you? He went and he sat down at his desk and he put his feet up on it next to a long, long tube. I looked at the tube. If you ask me, and you don't have to ask me because it's your money, you have it now, I would put it in a savings account for college. That would be a good start. $100, sir? Oh, yes, the $100 I sent home with your father the other day. When he didn't stop by on Monday, I gave it to him, so he could give it to you. But at that moment, he stopped. He looked hooked off his feet, and then he leaned forward. You never got the $100, did you? Oh, no. I got it. I mean, thanks. Yes, a savings account for college. That's a good idea. He stared at me for a long time. What? I said. You didn't get the baseball either. No, I got it. It's great. It's in my room right now. Thanks. Are you sure you got it? Yes, I'm sure. It was just like my father said, because you couldn't count on anything or anyone. Mr. Ballard sat back, nodded, and smiled a little. So then what can I do for you? I looked out his windows, past the orchids on the windowsill and down towards the river. It was wide, and the trees on the far side were starting to shake their leaves. It was getting colder. Do you ever practice horseshoes here? Mr. Ballard had horseshoes pits by the river, and we played in the cool with the sound of the water in our ears and the clanging of the shoes against our posts when he threw them, and the thud of the long shoes against the ground when I threw them. Here were the stats. Mr. Ballard threw 4 ringers in a row, and 5 in a row another time. He had 4 ringers altogether, and 6 leaners, which still count, by the way. And I had 1 leaner, which you remember still counts too. And I had 1 ringer where the shoe wrapped itself around on the post, spun around a couple times, and then dropped to the sand. I think Mr. Ballard was happier about that ringer than I was. Doug, you got the arc just right on that one. And it doesn't matter how many times it spins around, as long as it comes down flat like that. And just so you don't think that I really stink at horseshoes, you should know that even though that was my only ringer I threw, I did come close 4 other times. And I rang the post twice, and even though it doesn't count, it still isn't bad. A little more practice, and you'll be a better thrower than President Lyndon B. Johnson ever hoped to be. You can come by any time, okay? The shoes will always be waiting for you. He set them down against a stake. They'll be right here. So we walked back the river, and Mr. Ballard told me to stop by his office, and he'd have Mrs. Stenson see if she could find us some lemonade to celebrate my first ringer. And we got up there. Mrs. Stenson was standing by his desk, and there was someone else there holding a stack of framed pieces. There was a picture of a bird from you-know-where that was spread out on Mr. Ballard's desk. And Mrs. Stenson said, "You're just in time. We're down to 3 choices for the yellow shank." And Mr. Ballard went over to see it. And at that moment, I did too. It was about as far back from the blackback gull as you could get. The yellow shank wasn't the first thing you saw at all. You saw his whole world first. It was fall, and the grass was getting duller, and the trees were gold and that reddish brown that looks like colors of old bricks. The yellow shank was walking in a sunny spot, holding like he owned the place. The water in front of him was dark, and the woods beyond were darker still, really dark, and Audubon knew something about composition. He kept the top of the bird's back as straight as the horizon, right smack in the middle of the scene, with a beak held up just as flat and just as straight, and that eye that said, "I know where I belong." You couldn't help be a little jealous of that bird. But I leaned in close. The lines in the water matched the lines of the bird's beak. This would be easy to get. What would be hard to get were the legs. The back ways were poised as if it was going to leave its toe hand and push ahead. And the whole way of it said that the head and back wouldn't be moving at all, just the legs. How did he give you that way the bird would be moving, even though he didn't show him moving? "Any closer and we'll have to frame you too," said Mrs. Stenson. "I think," said the guy holding the black stack of the frames, "that if you're going to put it in the bookcase there, you'll want this mahogany frame to go with the wood." "But we're not sure if it's even going there. It could go by the window if the bird were looking outside, and then the mahogany wouldn't do at all." "What do you think?" Mr. Ballard said, and I looked up. He was asking me. "I think it belongs back in the book," I said. I know that made me sound like a jerk, a real jerk. I didn't even mean to say it. Mr. Ballard had supposedly already given me the signed baseball and $100 and stuff, and I was wearing his Timex watch. God, I needed to know when to shut up. But he had asked, after all. And the guy holding the stack of frames looked at me like I was trying to take bread from his mouth. And Mrs. Stenson looked at me like I was went a little too far too. And Mr. Ballard said, "Why?" "Because things belong in the class to which they came. They belong in the class to which they have been assigned." The guy with the stack of frames put another one on the corner of the print. "Perhaps this mixture of darker and lighter tone in this one would allow you to hang the print in either spot," he said. Mrs. Stenson looked down from the new frame and back at me, and Mr. Ballard drummed the fingers along the edge of the desk. He looked at them and at the yellow shank, and he let his fingers light on the sunny spot beneath it. Let's roll this thing up and put it back in its tube. I think I just heard a ringer. There aren't too many things around here that are whole, you know. You look hard at almost anything and it's probably beaten up somewhere or another. Beat up or dinged up. Sorry, guys. Or missing a piece or tattooed. Or maybe something starts out whole and then it just turns into junk over time. You know, like Joe Pepitone's cap getting rained on in the gutter somewhere. Probably you can't even tell it's a cap anymore. Probably you wouldn't even want to pick it up if you saw it. But it didn't start out that way. It started at Joe Pepitone's cap. And he was out on the field, the sun was beating down and from over the stands of Yankee Stadium, and he could smell the grass and the dirt to the infield beneath its brim. When you find something that's whole, you do what you can to keep it that way. And when you find something that isn't, well, then maybe it's not a bad idea to try to make it whole again. Maybe. I mean, what would you do if you found a baseball with only 215 stitches? Wouldn't you want to put it back and make one more stitch in it to make it all right? That's right. If you were wondering what 216 was, that's how many stitches there are in a baseball. And I know that all sounds cosmic, but that's what you would thought too if you had been in Marysville Free Public Library the day that I brought that tube back, when Mr. Powell took one look at it and knew what it was. You would have thought it too when he went back upstairs and Mr. Powell slid that yellow shank out of the tube and opened the glass case and turned the pages until he found the place between CCLXXXXXV11 and plate CCLXXX1X. And he laid the print back in. And if you looked at Mr. Powell's eyes, you would have thought what I thought. I'm going to get all these birds back. The Arctic tern, the stupid large-billed puffins, the brown pelican, and all the rest of them. They all will be back in this book. I'm going to get the birds back. And I'm also going to start drawing again. Ernie Echo came by for supper that night before he and my father were going off somewhere to look at a new pickup. And some idiot was selling for some price a whole lot less than what they should be selling it for. And all he wanted was $100 down payment. It would be a steal, Ernie Echo said, eating from the ham slice. And would I pass the mashed potatoes? My mother didn't say anything because she wasn't smiling. I went down to the mill yesterday, I said. My father and Ernie Echo looked at me, and my mother did too, with worried eyes, and she held her fork in midair. Yeah, said my father. I guess you two got the parking spots I won, I said. So? Doesn't cost Mr. Big Bucks Ballard anything, said Ernie Echo. It just makes him look good to all the little guys who work for him, said my father. He also said that he gave you the... He didn't give me a thing! Did you see me bring anything home? If I brought something home, I would have given it to you. Did you see me bringing it home? That's because he didn't give me a thing. Well, he said that he gave you a signed baseball and $100. My father put his two hands down on the table. He looked at me for a long time. What are you trying to say, kid? I'm just telling you what Mr. Big Bucks Ballard said. My father's hands twitched. If Mr. Big Bucks Ballard said he gave me the signed baseball and $100, then he is a liar. You got that? You know what I should have said? Even my brother knew what I should have said, because what felt like the whole long time, my brother whispered, Doug's got it. My father looked at my brother. Shut up! He turned back to me. I said Mr. Big Bucks Ballard is a freaking liar. You got that? And then I figured it out. I figured how Audubon got the yellow shank to move. He was staring into the dark place, like he's just about to cross the river that divides him from it. And its back foot is halfway up because he's about to push off, and he knows that he's what he's getting into, but he does it anyways, calm and smooth and straight. He's going to step into the middle of the picture where he should be, with the light in the back of him and the dark ahead. The whole world is waiting for him to do that. And I was waiting for him to do it too. And at that moment, I looked at my brother. Even though whatever it is in the dark is waiting for the yellow shank, he's going to do it anyway. Well, someone's a liar, I said. And here are the stats for that night. My dad missed me the first time because I leaned away. He missed me the second time because I pushed the chair back and got up. He just clipped me when I had to push through Ernie Echo's arm, the jerk. But then he missed me again when I spun around to get to the back door first. And you know what? I'm going to count that as a win. So I went back to the Marysville Free Public Library and I stayed until it closed at 9 o'clock. Mr. Powell left the book open to the yellow shank. That bird, he knew where he was going, even if he was going on stupid yellow legs. He knew. But that doesn't mean anything was going to be easier for me. When I got home late that night, my father was gone and my mother was in the bedroom and my brother was flipping baseball cards all by himself, which tells you something about how much he has going on between his ears. And I started up those stairs. "Do you know what a jerk you are?" he said. "Shut up," I said. "All you had to do was say, 'I got it.' That's all you had to do." I leaned over the banister. "Don't you ever want to just say, 'I got it' just once? Don't you ever want to?" "Every day, Duggo," he said. "Then why don't you?" "Because after you left, Duggo, who do you think he hollered at? Who do you think? And that's why she's upstairs, so you don't see her face, because she's been crying ever since supper. Do you get it now?" So I sat down on those stairs. "Do you get it, Duggo? Do you get it why you can't talk back to Dad?" "Shut up, it's not like you." "Like I what? Like I what, Duggo? Do you ever wonder what it's like to be so angry that you..." And then something happens, and after that, everyone figures out what you're like and what you're always going to be like, so you just decide to be it. But the whole time you're thinking, am I going to just be like him? Am I really going to just be like my dad? And then you get angrier because maybe you are going to be like him, but you don't want to be like him. He stopped and he wiped at his eyes. I'm not lying. My brother wiped his eyes. He was crying. "Go upstairs. There's something on the dresser. But I want you to put it somewhere where he can't find it." And I started up the stairs. And Duggo, even if you're a jerk, you still got guts. My brother said that. I'm not lying. And you know what else was on that dresser? And you know what he put on that dresser, right? At that moment, I carried that baseball downstairs and I hid it. "How did you?" "Drunks keep everything they want to hide in their cars." Flipping baseball cards, wiping at his eyes, flipping baseball cards. So I went to the basement and I put that signed baseball in the pocket of Joe Pepitone's jacket. And when I went back into our room, my brother was deep under the covers. His face was turned away from me. He was obviously embarrassed. "Thanks," I said. But he didn't answer. But I got it. On Monday, it was like I was walking into the center of the picture. I got the new brown paper book cover of the geography, the story of the world, and I decorated it with an Arctic tern on the one side and a yellow shank on the other, right in the middle of the paper. And when Mr. Barber walked by the desk holding his coffee, he opened my book and flipped through the pages, which were perfect. "Thanks for taking care of it so well," he said. And when I nodded, he smiled and then hit me lightly on the shoulder, like Joe Pepitone would do. And I turned in my chapter review map on the culture of China to Mr. McElroy and added a list of Chinese characters and their meanings that I wrote myself to make up for being late. Not bad for someone who at the beginning of the year could hardly, well, you remember. And in English, when we got to chapter 38 of Jane Eyre, which I had read twice already because of Miss Cowper's County Literacy Unit, Miss Cowper turned to me and said, "Let's have Duggo finish this novel for us." And I looked at her and I started to sweat. And I looked down at the page. Do you know how many words in Jane Eyre have more syllables than one than a word has any right to have? But you know what? I got it. I really got it. At least most of it. Lil Spicer said I was the best reader of the class, which was a lie, but so what? So what? And I raised my hand in Mrs. Vern's class, and even though it took a few tries, she finally called on me. And I'm not lying when I tell you that no one else in the class ever imagined a Z-axis. Mrs. Vern was pretty impressed and said that I must have a fabulous visual imagination. Did you hear that? She said I was fabulous. And then Pee Ree and the wrestling unit was still going on, but the so-called gym teacher didn't say anything when I ignored the lineup platoons and went outside to run. It was November now, and most of the trees had dropped their leaves off and were all bare and dark. But as long as the so-called gym teacher was going to let me run, I was going to run. It didn't hurt any that James Russell and Otis Bottom started to run with me. I didn't ask them to. They just saw me going outside and just started to come along. I guess. We mostly ran without saying anything. And in Mr. Ferris's class, well, you can imagine yourself handing in lab reports that were getting Clarence rocking that little wooden hooves off. And then you'd have it. So after school on Monday, I asked Lil if she wanted to walk over to the Ballard paper mill, and she said, "Why?" And I said I'd like to show her how to throw horseshoes, and she said, "How hard could that be?" And I said, "It's harder than you think." And she said she'd guess she'd try, and we went down to the mill to the horseshoe pits. The shoes were there, just like Mr. Ballard promised. And I showed Lil how to throw a shoe at the top, how to stand with her heel at the post, and how to swing her arms a couple times. And she threw the first one 10 feet, which isn't, in case you even know, even in the neighborhood of how far it had to go. And then she threw the second one 10 feet again, and so got disgusted that she threw the third one as hard as she could, and it hit on its side and rolled almost all the entire way to the post. And then she figured out that she had the technique down, and she threw the last one as hard as the third, except that she didn't let it go until the end of her swing. And the horseshoe went straight up into the air, and she screamed and ducked. And I bent over her, and I held her so that it wouldn't hit her as it came down, except it came down next to us instead of on top of us. And when we stood up, she looked at me like I was noble and heroic. Do you know what that feels like? It felt fabulous. And then we collected the horseshoes and walked to the other post, and she said, "Why don't you throw one?" And so I did. It was perfect. I swung on my arms twice, and I let the horseshoes go just right, and it flew up slowly, gracefully, and then it turned once and let its two ends come down and landed flat, skidded on the sand just enough to ting the post. It was a beautiful sound that, well, I'm not lying. I missed the stupid post by a mile, but it doesn't matter because something else happened when we finished throwing horseshoes that was even better. Reader, I kissed her. A quiet walk back we had, she and I. But on that day, I kissed Lil Spicer. Folks, that is the end of Chapter 5. I hope you enjoyed this rendition by Mr. Hart. Not a ton of questions today. I do want more, so I am curious what your guys' first impressions are of Mr. Ballard. I also want you guys to think about all the fights that Doug's gotten into. I want you guys to think, do you think he started the fights? Do you think other people started them? I think it's, obviously, I think that number of fights that he's got into, definitely we can learn something about Doug from it. I also want you to take note of how many fights did Doug win compared to the amount of fights that he lost, or there was a draw, as he called it. And what does that tell us about him as well? But with that, guys, I'm going to leave you here. I hope you guys all have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Everybody keep staying safe, and I hope to see everybody this Wednesday for... Actually, never mind. That won't be both classes. So, but I hope to see you guys later this week for our video chats, I will say. So take care, everybody.